So this is the National Broadband Plan resumed. I'd like to welcome from the University of Limerick Professor Eamon Reeves, Head of Department of Economics, and Dr Donal Palcic, Lecturer in Economics, to this meeting here to discuss the National Broadband Plan. So before I begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such ways to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements you've made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. And I just remind members to turn off your mobile phones or to switch them onto flight mode. So I understand you're both going to make opening statements, and I might invite Professor Reeves to begin with your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good afternoon. I'm Eamon Reeves. I'm the Head of Department of Economics at the University of Limerick, and along with my departmental colleague, Dr Donal Palcic, we specialise in infrastructure-related research into aspects of public procurement, including PPPs. We wish to thank the committee for the invitation to appear before you this afternoon. A detailed briefing note has been submitted to the committee, and I will summarise some of the main points in this opening statement. I wish to emphasise that we have had no direct involvement or advisory role in the NBP procurement. Our access to information has been confined to that which has been placed in the public domain, much of which has been heavily redacted. We wish to state up front that, having observed events and analysed documentation that is publicly available, we have formed a view that the procurement approach adopted has not satisfied the criteria necessary to ensure that the key objective of value for money will be achieved. As the committee is aware, the procurement model being used for the NBP is a gap funding model, which is essentially a type of public-private partnership. I wish now to examine the features of the PPP model and relate them back to the NBP. So PPPs can be defined as long-term infrastructure contracts between the state and the private contractor. The main characteristics of a typical infrastructure PPP include: 1. Competition for contracts; 2. Bundling of the different stages of the project life cycle into one contract; 3. Risk transfer to the private sector; and 4. A significant element of private finance. Although the gap funding model possesses these characteristics, it differs from other PPPs used in Ireland to date, since ownership of the infrastructure will remain with the private contractor at the end of the contractual period. The principal economic justification for adopting PPP is that it provides scope for achieving value for money, or VFM. However, the achievement of VFM in turn depends critically on what may be referred to as key VFM drivers. The main VFM drivers are competition for contracts and risk transfer, and I wish to discuss both in the context of the NBP. So, the importance of competition for contracts cannot be overemphasised. Competition creates incentives for bidders to reduce costs and delays and to develop proposals of higher quality. The recommendation in favour of the gap funding model was based on the assumption that the market for the contract would be competitive. However, once CSIRO and AIR withdrew from the process, the principal justification for continuing the procurement no longer applied. In general, the potential negative consequences of continuing with a non-competitive procurement are: 1. Opportunistic behaviour by the bidder during contract negotiations leading to price increases, and 2. Renegotiations after the contract is signed. The international evidence on PPP shows that these problems do indeed frequently materialise when competition for contracts is absent. In this context, it is worth considering if the evidence suggests that the lack of competition for the NBP contract has impacted on the project costs to date. One development that raises suspicions in this respect is the substantial increase in projected costs that will arise due to the preferred bidder rolling out fibre in the 300,000 premises area that AIR carved out of the initial intervention area. Would this have been agreed if there was real competition for the contract? Turning to risk transfer. Optimal risk transfer is one of the main drivers of VFM in PPP projects, and the available information indicates that the preferred bidder of the NBP will indeed take on significant risk, particularly in relation to construction, operating risk and revenue risk. The risk category I wish to focus on is on financial risk. Typically, in privately financed PPPs, financial risk is assumed by investors that contribute equity and loans to the PPP. Both providers have skin in the game, and this incentivises them to ensure that contractual obligations are met. In the case of the NBP, we eventually learned that the level of private equity is €220 million. This is not a trivial sum of money, but it still accounts for a very low percentage of total project costs. The concerns expressed by Mr Robert Watt, Secretary-General of DEPR, were relevant in this regard when he noted that by 2028 the private bidder will have recouped most of its investment while the state will have invested €2.44 billion at that stage. In addition, the gap funding model for the NBP differs from earlier PPPs in Ireland, as it appears that the special purpose vehicle is not borrowing significant amounts from banks or international capital markets. Instead, it appears that they will work on a cash flow basis and rely on payments from the Exchequer as a project progresses. Unlike other privately financed PPPs, therefore, this gap funding model approach will not possess the advantages that arise from the due diligence and close monitoring of all aspects of the deal by experienced lenders. Overall, it appears that some of the risk-sharing advantages that typically apply to PPP projects do not apply in this procurement model, which increases concerns that the procurement will not deliver value for money. I also wish to make some points about the governance of the NBP. I will preface my comments by stating that the international evidence consistently shows that accountability and transparency are the critical conditions that must be satisfied if good governance is to be achieved. There have been several problems with the governance of the NBP. In relation to the project appraisal stage of the NBP, I wish to highlight that there is very limited information about the cost-benefit analysis in the public domain, and the available data does not include detailed breakdowns, evaluations, and assumptions, etc. On the one hand, it is reassuring that the CBA has been scrutinised by DEPR, but the fact that DEPR has concluded that, and I quote, the CBA is not credible and it is questionable whether it is consistent with the public spending quote is a matter of huge concern. On the choice of the procurement model, the principal point that I wish to emphasise is that the financial appraisals underpinning the choice of the gap funding model are not publicly available. It is not clear if these were subject to independent scrutiny, for example by DEPR or the National Development Finance Agency. Nevertheless, I would recommend that these are published in order to improve the accountability of key decision makers. The governance problems that have been witnessed during the procurement process have been widely discussed. In economic terms, the fundamental weakness has been the decision to continue the process with one bidder. Other issues have arisen in relation to the changes in the composition of the bidders' consortium, the drip feed of information about key aspects of the procurement, including the precise level of equity being invested by the preferred bidder, and controversy around interactions between the relevant minister and investors in the consortium behind the remaining bid. Overall, the governance problems that have arisen are such that the procurement lacks the required level of legitimacy, thereby eroding public confidence in the process. There are legitimate concerns about the overall justification of the project, the chosen procurement model, the potential costs of the project and knock-on effects for other investment priorities. It is our considered view that the current procurement should be terminated and more affordable alternatives explored. I will now hand over to my colleague Dr Palcic, whose opening statement will build on some of the points I've raised here. Thank you.
Very much, Dr Palcic.
Okay, as my colleague noted earlier, our briefing note that was submitted to the committee contains more detailed information on the points that we wish to raise, but I'll summarise some of my main concerns here. One of the most important and controversial aspects of the debate surrounding the plan to date relates to the gap funding model that's been adopted. And a number of the assumptions made in KPMG's 2015 ownership report that underpin the decision were questionable at best and appear even more dubious now given the events that have unfolded since. Their original assumptions underpinning the gap funding model were essentially that placing the long-term ownership of the network with the private sector would allow bidders to leverage the use of their existing infrastructure and encourage them to continue to invest in the network to develop and exploit new markets, and that the aforementioned benefits would be reflected in the strategic value that bidders would place on winning the contract, which in a competitive tendering process would drive down the amount of subsidy required. Strong competition among existing industry players is highlighted by KPMG as one of the key drivers behind their estimation that the gap funding model would achieve the lowest cost to the Exchequer. It's difficult to understand, however, how KPMG could assume a strong level of competition, since only Air and Cyro could realistically be considered as having the ability to leverage their existing assets to deliver the plan at a lower cost to the public purse. Moreover, at the time that KPMG was making its recommendation, Air had already announced plans to invest in approximately 300,000 premises within the intervention area, and the risk of Air moving forward with its plans and the impact that this would have on the fundamental nature of the plan appeared to have been ignored when the decision to proceed with the gap funding model was made in July 2016. A number of the assumptions in relation to the other ownership options examined by KPMG are also highly questionable. For example, they stated that the DBFOM option would involve significant additional subsidy as a result of the government likely seeking step-in rights to operate the network in the event of a contract termination. The fact that such step-in rights will be built into the current contract with Granagh and McCourt calls into question why KPMG assumed the cost of such rights would occur only in the DBFOM option. In order to fully assess all of the assumptions made by KPMG in their ownership report, it's imperative that the financial appraisal underpinning their analysis be published in full. Without such transparency, it's difficult to avoid the suspicion that the assumptions made were engineered to deliver a recommendation for the gap funding model only, especially given the belief at the time that it could achieve an off-balance sheet accounting and budgeting treatment. A critical juncture in the NBP procurement process was the signing in April 2017 of a commitment deal with AIR to remove 300,000 premises from the intervention area. This development had grave consequences in relation to competition for the contract and the cost of subsidy. In terms of subsidy, the original estimated budget for the plan was between 500 million and €1 billion. We know from KPMG's single bidder solution assessment report published in December 2018 that the estimated subsidy for the plan in April 2017, after AIR's 300,000 premises were removed, was 787 million. What remains unclear is the exact cause of the increase in the cost of subsidies since then. The Department and KPMG have recently stated that when AIR and Granagh and McCourt submitted their detailed solution submissions in September 2017, both bids included significantly higher level of subsidy than the Department's budget model, but we've not been given any detail as to why the bids submitted were far higher than expected. Since AIR has withdrawn from the competition, it appears that the cost of subsidy to the Exchequer has increased further. KPMG's 2018 report highlights how the major contributing factors to the increase in subsidy requested by Granagh and McCourt are: 1, the decision to move from renting AIR's wholesale network in the 300,000 premises area to NBP Co deploying its own fibre in the same area, and 2, an increase in the blended equity IRR reflecting an assumed higher level of risk. And while Analysis Mason touched on this issue with the committee here last week, there's still serious questions as to exactly how much additional cost has been incurred as a result of the decision to roll out a parallel fibre network in the 300,000 premises area, and why Granagh and McCourt have been allowed to do so. The Department needs to clarify if this has been done purely so that Granagh and McCourt can connect back to the metropolitan area networks for their backhaul needs, and what the comparative cost of using AIR's regulated wholesale network and backhaul services would have been. And unless the Department can provide convincing answers as to why AIR's fibre can't be used, it's difficult to see this as anything other than a very costly duplication of infrastructure paid for by the Irish taxpayer. I'd like to conclude with some issues in relation to the governance of the NBP. The success or otherwise of the plan will critically depend on the appropriate implementation and governance of the final contract. We've been told that an in-house unit will be established within the Department to monitor the contract and will require a budget of up to €10 million per annum, covering up to 10 permanent civil servants and support by specialist external advisors. However, given the sheer complexity and scale of the contract, it's worth asking how realistic the proposed budget is in terms of ensuring the appropriate level of governance and oversight that will be required. Outside of the cost implications of establishing a large-scale governance and regulatory structure for the plan within the Department, the decision to do so also had a significant impact on the competitive tension for the contract. For example, one of the stated reasons for AIR's withdrawing from the competition was the fact that it would have to provide access to its network at prices below the regulated level set by Comreg in the intervention area. As a regulated entity, AIR has to ensure equivalence all over the country and would therefore be forced to offer access to its network across the country at the same lower intervention area price if it won the contract. Another factor affecting the incentives for AIR to bid for the contract was the restriction that winning the contract would impose on its wholesale market activities. If it won the contract, its wholesale division, Open Air, would not be allowed to sell wholesale products in the intervention area, whereas other operators would be allowed to offer wholesale products across the country, including the intervention area. While the logic behind such clear lines of separation is understandable, the fact that AIR is already regulated by Comreg across the country, but the Department has proposed setting up a separate regulatory structure for the intervention area with conflicting requirements in relation to, for example, access prices, made it very difficult for AIR to continue with its bid, and this again calls into question how KPMG and the Department could have assumed that there would be strong competition for the contract from bidders such as AIR that would drive down the cost of subsidy to the government. Our briefing notes raise a number of other concerns that we have with the procurement process to date. Professor Reeves and I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to present our observations, and we'd be happy to take any questions that committee members may have at this time.
Thank you very much for your presentations, and you both have very significant experience in on an economic and an academic level in relation to public-private partnerships, and we very much value your input in our analysis here today. Could you tell me a little bit about your experience in the telecoms market as opposed to other areas?
Well, in terms of whether we are specialists in the telecoms area, I wouldn't actually consider that to be a fair description. But in relation to our experience, we have written a book on the privatisation experience in Ireland, which was largely centred on the story around Eircom. That was published back in 2011, and subsequently published peer-reviewed papers on telecoms policy arising from the privatisation of Eircom, which obviously would have prompted a lot of the interest that we have in this particular area. So we have a degree of experience in terms of just specifically the telecom sector, but it's confined to that.
That would be the same for yourself, Dr. Palcic.
Yeah, I'd largely agree. We don't have telecom engineering backgrounds, but we have extensive experiencing of looking at the impact of, say, privatisation on the telecoms industries in different countries across Europe, looking at the regulatory impacts. And we've published different peer-reviewed papers and, as Owen mentioned, a book on the privatisation experience in Ireland, and that was largely all related to Eircom and the telecom sector in Ireland. So from that point of view, at a policy level and ownership level regulation, I'd say we would have a good bit of experience.
Okay, thank you. I'll just move on to my colleagues here. Deputy Timmy Dooley.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. And just to thank Professor Reeves and Dr. Palcic for their presence. The documents you've provided and the executive summaries that you have given us today really sets out a very clear picture. There's very little further to question you on. You've made it very clear that using your academic position, your experience in procurement, that quite frankly the process that was undertaken, whilst it might have started out with best endeavour, and there was a certain context to the gap funding model, that effectively ended or evaporated as soon as the others had pulled out, and that's something which I think we've been concerned about in the committee for some time. So from a policy perspective, it's clear that the tender process or the consultative dialogue process should have halted at that point, and we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. And it seems if you follow the process, the position by the government or department all the time has been you just didn't want it to fail. It couldn't fail. It was too important, even when all the fundamentals that underpinned the particular process had changed. That the top-line issue of getting a broadband service to the consumers in the intervention area was such that you had to keep going, which leaves us in a very difficult position. I think you talk about opportunistic behaviour and that the potential for that when there's no competitive, there's no competition really in the process. And I think that certainly is something that we identified here, and you've identified it in terms of the parallel building of the network. Have you any kind of idea what, based on your looking at the information that's published, what that cost might have been, that additional cost piece to build the network out over the existing one rather than just splicing into it? That's really the first one. On the state aid rules, do you have any concerns about the potential, and this may be an area that you don't have expertise in, I understand it if you don't, but do you have any concern that the fact that there's an additional taxpayer-funded network now being rolled out through through the 300,000 premises area, that may not comply with state aid rules? Or do you believe there's some contractual agreement that can be put in place that will prevent the final bidder from using their network in that area? That's really all, because I have to say you've given an exceptionally comprehensive and useful presentation to us.
Dr. Palcic.
Okay, on the additional cost of rolling out their own fibre, I mean, we're dealing with heavily redacted documents, and that's all we can effectively analyse. So we've no idea what the additional cost would be, given it's always redacted. But it's clear that it's obviously much higher than the department's budget model, which assumed that they would be renting Eir's wholesale fibre product. But it's not just, I think if you read through Analysis Mason's technical assessment report and the KPMG's single bidder solution assessment report from 2018, I mean, they're highlighting lots of other areas where there's increased cost as a result of, you know, a redesigned network and a redesigned solution being put forward by Grant Henry Court. So even in terms of, well, there's obviously a big additional cost, and I would say in terms of time frame, that's a lot of you know, extra fibre that has to be laid, and that's going to obviously increase the time frame. It's partly why we've gone from maybe a 5 to a 7 year rollout, but there are other things around even the technology that they're choosing to use. They're putting in a kind of next generation technology in terms of the optical equipment. That again was different to what the department had assumed would be the case in terms of the current type of technology, maybe refreshed in 5 to 7 years' time. You know, as the industry evolves.
But that because that was one of the reasons for the gap funding model in the first instance, that the ultimate winner would find a situation where, or the benefit to the state would be that they would continue to invest in the technology. So what you're effectively saying is, because there's no competition, they're getting the latest generation right now funded by the taxpayer rather than funded from within the business that, you know,
it seems like a bit.
Through.
It seems like a bit like in order to get the upfront capex and obviously the subsidies can only. Government subsidies can only cover capex. It does seem like they're putting in the more advanced technology now, which means the refresh is going to happen maybe later in the 2020s. But you know, considering they're projecting such a low estimated maybe take up in the early years, gold plating the type of technology that they're putting in right now, when they're assuming very low take up, is I think Analysis Mason said maybe like a 25% additional cost in terms of the margin that it might be in terms of the report, versus putting in the current technology when they're up and running and maybe the take-up is obviously increasing in the future, then do the typical refresh that any other internet service provider would be doing in, say, the mid-2020s, and probably funding that from user revenues rather than a subsidised capex. To me, that would, you know, I'd say if there was more competitive tension in the process, maybe they would have been forced to obviously go with the lower cost capex in order to try and win the bid.
I just add to that, I would suggest that the fact that we're at a situation now where there hasn't been competition, we've got to the last leg of the process, but the scope for the preferred bidder to bargain to their own advantage is heavily increased by the lack of this competitive tension. And this is exactly what our fears would have been when we heard or learned first that we were down to one bidder. And this is exactly how it's playing out.
The defence, as you know, by the department has been, well, that they knew the costs anyway, because there was some comparative there based on submission by AIR at an earlier stage in the process. But you're very clear that the competitive tension really would have taken place in the latter stages of the process, and usually as part of the final bid price, which there was no.
Exactly, and also you've got to take into account, yes, the department does appear to have a good handle on the costs, but the other side of the equation are the revenues, and it was on the mix between the costs and the revenues that the competitive tension would play out. And thereby you'd expect to get the advantages that underpin the gap funding model, but unfortunately.
And of course, if there was greater competitive tension closer to the final point, the level of investment by the company concerned would obviously be greater, because that's something which could be scored against.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think even the Analysis Mason, they pointed out that on the demand side, that Grant Henry Court were being highly conservative, far more conservative than the department's estimation for future demand. But again, that allows them to lower their projected revenues. They've been obviously increasing their projected costs by taking questionable enough decisions that have really upped maybe the cost beyond what they might should be, and that then means that they need a higher subsidy and there's less strategic value. All of that has just forced up the subsidy, and that's happened really, I think, after ERA has pulled out.
Okay. No, thank you very much.
Deputy Ryan.
Very much indeed. In your presentation, Mr. Reeves, you said you were concentrating on the financial risk, but I wanted to ask you one area. I don't know whether you've examined it, because this is complex and it's used to, you're used to looking at PPPs and so on. One of the questions is on the revenue risk, because when you talk to department officials and others, they say, oh no, you don't understand that the developer in this case is taking on the significant revenue risk. And I don't know if you've assessed that, and it's been difficult because we're all working on blacked out sections of papers and so on. Have you looked at that in any way to assess what the where that risk is residing?
No, we haven't looked at it in detail for the reasons that you just outlined. We simply don't have that information. It is fair to say that we're told, and we've been provided with a specimen contract, that they, for instance, if the if the revenues are higher than projected, there will be a clawback. And in that sense, they do actually take risk, and obviously they take the downside risk as well. So if the revenues don't accrue, they're penalised within the contract on that basis. And that's very important, but we need to take into account a few things around risk, generally speaking. There are lots of risks. When at the initial stages, I would have expected that they ran risk workshops where they identified at least 10 to 20 risks. They would have worked out the probabilities of those occurring and placed values on them. So we've mentioned just construction, operating, revenue, but there are other risks as well. And I think a key factor around risk transfer is that it's very central to the whole value for money argument in favour of a PPP. But what's in the contract isn't necessarily what materialises once the contract is up and running and it's managed. So an interesting lesson came from the schools PPPs, where it was identified that in the first 3 years of the schools running, the management of the contracts were such that they weren't really up to scratch, and that risk transfer wasn't in reality imposed, i.e. penalties imposed for poor performance, etc. Which brings you to a whole discussion around how these contracts will be governed. Now, in the case of those schools PPPs, the National Development Finance Agency took over the management of those schools contracts. There's a very interesting point that I think I'd like to take the opportunity to make, is that I'm curious about where the NDFA has been in all of this. The NDFA is a specialist PPP procurement agency, right? And the PPPs in this country that have caused the most problems were ones that were not procured by the NDFA, but rather procured by individual departments. Education in the case of the schools projects, Department of Environment in the case of the incinerator project, and now the NVP, where you have the department. And the question is, where is the NDFA? I know they played an advisory role, but in terms of the overall governance plans and what has happened in terms of appraisal and so on, I think that is a question that needs to be asked, and something that certainly should be addressed going forward.
I do recall being at a budget oversight committee here on this issue of PPPs, and I can't remember who it was now, whether it was the department itself or the Fiscal Advisory Council or others, but they were making the point that one of the downsides of the PPPs is that you're paying much higher costs for money versus the state funding it. Now, that's on the basis that you'd be going to the capital markets to issue a bond or to raise lending to, as you say, which would be a more standard PPP model. But in this instance, it's probably even more expensive again, because it's a return on equity is the payment rather than return on capital. In a sense, we're covering the capital costs. So in this instance, it's even probably, we don't know what that figure, the return on investment is, but it's likely even higher than what it would be if it was a more standard PPP
it's pretty hard. Again, you're in the dark. It's pretty hard to work that one out. But I would say because there's such a small amount of equity going into this, 220 million is less than 1% of the overall project costs. The rest of it is actually going to be exchequer financed. So in that regard, it doesn't suffer from the cost disadvantage that would have applied in PPPs previously, where they would have been entirely privately financed, usually at a kind of 10% equity, 90% debt ratio. Okay, and so what I'm saying is that those PPPs would probably have had a higher cost. The concern is one that I outlined in my opening statement, is that the degree of equity is so low that it pulls the rug from under the, in terms of the mechanisms that should drive the advantages around a PPP model like the gap funding model. They just don't have enough skin in the game.
I suppose one of the variations would be then, as I said, okay, the cost of capital wouldn't or the cost of the debt isn't so much an issue, but in a sense, the ultimate risk for the state here is if the project goes wrong, they're carrying the big capital cost risk. If there was at least a private financing element to it, the banks, to a certain extent, or those bondholders would carry some of the risk cost in the event of it terminating. Or
Yeah, I agree. And if you think back to the schools project when Carillion went burst, which was last January, 12 months. All right. What actually happened in that case was it was the banks and it was the private sector that took the risk. And at the time, there was a lot of panic around the fact that the schools weren't opening, which showed, of course, that the ultimate risk taker is always the service user. Okay. But at the time when Carillion went into bankruptcy, the government was actually, and the NDFA was managing the contract. They were in a position where they could stand back and let it be resolved within the SPV. And that's actually what happened eventually. I mean, as I said, there was a cost paid by the service user, but that won't apply in this case.
Okay. Your advice in the closing paragraph in your presentation was that it's your considered view that the current procurement should be terminated and more affordable alternatives explored, similar in many ways to the advice that the Department of Public Expenditure Reform seems to be advocating. Have you any suggestions as to how that more affordable alternatives, how would that work? What might be the timescales? What are the downsides in that?
Yeah, okay, it's very difficult to say, given the amount of information that we have and where our expertise actually lies. I have read through what Deeper have proposed in terms of their Plan Z. And to a large degree, I have to say that I can understand where they're coming from, because two of the key words that struck me in the proposal was that it will be budget-led. Because it will be, in other words, it will be affordable. Because of the escalated cost on this project, the point that is made by Deeper about the fact that this will actually mean that there will be opportunity cost. There will be other projects within the National Development Plan that will have to be foregone. Okay, I mean that should not happen. Okay, under the more modest and maybe conservative plan that they have put forward. But in relation to whether I have, or my colleague has, specific plans, that are proposals. I don't think personally I can't come up with something better than Deeper have. But maybe Donald would like to contribute.
No, I mean, short of a retendering and a more public option. There really isn't any other alternative, but that comes at a very big time cost as well in terms of going back to the market and all of that. So, I mean, Deeper's probably seems the more realistic, and that allows you maybe get the time to maybe retender a more state-led approach. Just quickly on your revenue risk, I mean, as I mentioned, if you read through the analysis, Mason one in particular, it does appear that Granite McCourt are being extremely conservative in terms of what they are saying the demand will be, especially in the early years. So of course they're going to have to bear some of the risk in terms of getting people, how many people connect as they roll it out, as they meet their various deployment targets and get their different subsidy payments. But the fact that they're being so conservative and building in a lot of different margins, so it's not just maybe a higher IRR that they're building into their cost model. If you read through it too, they're building in a lot of different margins on the labour and the capex and all of the different things that the subcontractors will be carrying out on their behalf, have built in a margin, and the analysis Mason and KPMG reports state that has obviously imposed significant additional costs. So they are covering themselves as best as they can by taking on that risk.
One last personal question. I don't mean it's a small country. Mr. Reeves, you're not related to Tom Reeves at all. You have a striking resemblance to the former telecoms and energy regulator, no?
I can confirm I'm not related.
It wasn't
to Tom
I was just wondering, it wasn't.
I've had this all my life.
Deputy Stanley.
Thanks very much, and I want to welcome our two guests for taking the time out to come in. Look at I suppose the concerns that I have around this is around obviously the cost to the taxpayer, the risk to the public finances, the total absence of competition. Now that we have a single bidder, the fact that the ownership at the end of it, will be the investor, the subsidy, and related to that, the heir 240,000 households and premises now, and the governance of it. The fact that what's set out in the plan that NBI, with the structure that will be as it is, with one person representing the investor who puts in, 95% of the cash up front, the taxpayer, and there'll be 8 representing the outfit that puts in 5 or 6%. Just when you put all that together, look, from following up what you've been saying, that you have extensive experience in terms of the PPP areas, public-private partnerships, and obviously this is a public-private partnership of sorts. And just a question around that: have you ever seen a PPP like this before? And if you did, was it a success? And the other question I have is in relation to the National Development Finance Agency, that you touched on it briefly, that that major projects, they normally would be involved. And this is, ministers have told us time and time again, both in the chamber and in these committee rooms, that this is the biggest tendering process ever undertaken by the state. This is absolutely massive. It's a ginormous project, and the scale of it, now we know in terms of finance, is a lot bigger. And is there any particular, can you think of any reason why the government would not hand that over to the National Development Finance Agency? Because the department, there's up to 80 people working on this, according to the replies that I got to PQs, 80 people working on this for a number of years now. And I suspect that there are, bail loads of information and tender documents and legal documents and procurement documents and every other sort of a document, that the whole process is bogged down and it's in a quagmire. But can you think of, is there any particular reason why it wouldn't go to the NDFA?
I might take the first one in terms of any other project that's used the gap funding approach. In KPMG's ownership report, the only other gap funding model I think that they used as a case study, so they did look at other countries, was the Broadband Development UK programme. And one of their central criticisms that they put in that report was that the lack of competitive tension in that programme in the early stages. It was just down to one bidder every time in terms of the lots, and it was BT that won that. And they said effectively that you have to ensure competition in order for the gap funding model to work. But just last night, Indacon's review of the National Broadband Scheme, which was carried out in November 2017, was published on the department's website. And the NBS, the National Broadband Scheme, that was when effectively 3 won the contract to roll out mobile 3G at the time technology, mobile broadband to rural areas that couldn't otherwise get it. That used a gap funding model. Now, it was on a much smaller scale, about 200 million capex. I think the state funded about 80 million of that, and they got 36 million back from the European Regional Development Fund. But Indacon's recommendations in relation to the gap funding model, I think, are instructive here. They basically say that the whole calculation of strategic value, which is central to all of this, in terms of the subsidy that's going to be required, you've got your revenues, which you hope you're going to obviously estimate somewhat accurately, your costs, and then a strategic value that the bidders are going to attach to owning the network at the end of it, because private ownership, it obviously remains in private ownership with the gap funding model. They said, estimating the strategic value is extremely difficult for a government to come up with a figure like that. And they effectively said that the only way of ensuring that that figure is going to obviously be more accurate is if there's strong competitive tension in the whole process. So the fact that this review only came out now and it took a bit of pushing, I think I put in a Freedom of Information request for this last March, and there was a bit of a delay in it coming out. Part of it is probably due to that recommendation. They zeroed in on the strategic value side of things and pretty much said it was somewhat dubious in terms of coming up with this figure. And when you look at KPMG's ownership report, it's the strategic value that they're assuming in their financial appraisal, which they have not published, that is driving the recommendation of the gap funding model. It's the major difference between it and all of the other ownership options that they assume, because they assumed similar costs and revenues for the public ownership model. But then when you look at what they're saying the difference is, they're saying the difference is, along with some of the startup costs, the strategic value and the estimate on that. So we have already used the gap funding model in the NBS, and the recommendation was that it's all about competition, and especially in a telecom sector where there's a lot of uncertainty around market developments in terms of potential competition, technological developments, and when all of that complexity is in the mix, you want a very, very carefully designed mechanism, was the recommendation coming out from Indicon.
Reeves, I think, wants to come in on this.
Yeah, because I have a few questions.
Yeah.
Well, if it suits, I was just going to address your other question in relation to the governance and the NDFA. Would you?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we'll let you in on that, and then we'll let him ask all his questions after.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, to get the best value out of the specialist PPP procurement agency, that is the NDFA, unfortunately, that time has passed. I would have recommended that they would have been involved in the appraisal, particularly the financial appraisal. Instead, KPMG were contracted to do that, and I would have suggested that the NDFA could or should have been involved to a large degree in the procurement of the project, and again, it's too late for that now. Generally speaking, I think it's a good idea, for the governance of infrastructure projects generally, to see separation between the agencies that take care of the different stages of the procurement. It doesn't always happen, even in terms of international experience, but what we're witnessing, in my view, is the fact that the department doesn't want to let go of this project. They've invested so much time and so much resources, some of it internal resources, a lot of it, resources expended in terms of hiring outside consultants. But this has run for years now, and there's a huge reluctance institutionally and at a political level to actually to change tack. And unfortunately, that seems to be where we are. But if I had a blank page and I was to suggest going forward how we improve governance, I would suggest a good way of doing so would be to separate the roles of the agency that sponsors the project, that would be the department, with the agency that conducts the appraisal, e.g. the cost-benefit analysis and the financial analysis, the value for money assessments, and separate that role again with the agency that procures the project, and again a separate agency to manage the project thereafter, to avoid the kind of I will say rut that the project has got into now. That's just a suggestion. And can I make one more point very quickly on the governance? I mentioned the resources that were expended on this, and a lot of resources I expect, and I think PwC mentioned a figure at your committee last week. A lot of resources were spent on the cost-benefit analysis, and unfortunately we don't have the details in the public domain in order to interrogate that cost-benefit analysis. But I find it very difficult to understand how the bottom line figures have changed so much. It was good that DEEPR scrutinised this and they held the consultants to account in relation to the assumptions that underpinned some of the CBA. But when I learned that the benefits after DEEPR had consulted were reduced by in the region of $1 billion, but suddenly the costs went down due to costs were brought down as well because an error that had been recurring throughout the whole process hadn't been spotted. I found that very, very difficult to understand, and it calls into question again how, generally speaking, we govern different stages of big procurement projects like this and who we rely on to do so. And not relying on a state agency like the NDFA that has built up expertise is hard to fathom.
Deputy Stanley, if you want to ask all your questions and then I'll go.
Just in relation to the I was just following the pattern with the others. In relation to the your submission, you said that the current procurement process should be terminated and a more affordable alternative should be explored. And I just wanted to ask you there in relation to that, would the ESB or a model based on the ESB network be a viable alternative? And just related to that, to try and be helpful to move it along, that, in your experience of studying PPPs, you have experience in looking more broadly with the procurement processes. And considering that, and we're being told there's an awful lot of heavy lifting done in terms of detailed analysis, and obviously there's 80 people working on it, and I think they've been working hard on it. So there's obviously a lot of information, a lot of experience, a lot of learning done. A lot of that's been built up. So roughly speaking, do you believe that we could complete a competitive tendering procurement process within a year or so? And related to it, and I'll tie the three pieces together, you're familiar with the negotiated procedure without prior public notice that can be used. And in your opinion, could this be used to select the ESB or a body like DSB to deliver the NDP without a competitive tender?
Just on the very last point in relation to without a competitive tender, I think there would be serious state aid issues there. My understanding is that if the ESB were to be brought in, it would have to be under competitive conditions. And I understand also, just in relation to the feasibility of using the ESB, from listening to the deliberations of the committee at other sessions, I mean, there are real issues in relation to the extent so the viability of bringing of using the ESB's infrastructure, and I won't get into the details because they've been discussed already. But ideally, the state should lever the the network infrastructure of the companies that it owns, i.e., the ESB or VIA and so on. And if you could turn the clock back, I wish the state had actually, the government had run with the original option, which was to build a new era, a national broadband company, which is part of the New Era plan, published in the run-up to the 2011 election. But again, that ship has sailed.
Okay, I'm going to bring in...
And just the final question I have is just in relation to the intervention area. When the decision was taken, I noticed it's of huge concern to me at the time, and since, we said it to allow AIR to do the 300,000 easy-to-reach households, and they effectively donuted a lot of villages and towns and areas where there was significant residential development in rural areas. It's now 340,000 homes and premises that's actually been serviced with it, and that seemed to be that appears to be have derailed the whole procurement process. And to your mind, is that the reason why the other two bidders pulled out? And is it the reason that the cost essentially went from 800,000, just under 800 million at that stage, to 3,000 million now, in terms of the subsidy to fill that gap? Like, that's what the gap is. The gap is 2.95 billion.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of whether it's the sole factor, I mean, it obviously, CSIRO haven't really said, I mean, they've more or less hinted that that was one of the reasons why they walked away. It's not just, I think because they were probably the most commercially viable premises, because you would have gone to them first on any fibre rollout, and they would have been your initial revenues that you would have been relying on, it definitely had an impact on the cost of subsidy, and that's a big chunk of your potential revenue gone, the quicker revenue to get to in terms of the deployment. But I mean...
And was it necessary to allow that to happen?
It had to happen.
Because there's been a comparison made with, there was a comparison made at one here in the last fortnight by somebody who would have a lot of knowledge on these matters, that it was comparable to saying you're going to build a motorway from Limerick to Cork, and you were going to allow a section that you had to privatise a section of that. Yeah. Which wouldn't make sense.
Under state aid rules, they simply had no choice. I mean, if you read the state aid rules and you read the state aid report for this plan, if a private sector operator or any commercial operator, it could have been the ESB, it could be anybody, any commercial operator, if they have plans to invest in the intervention area within the next 2 years, then it won't qualify for a state aid rule. You can't subsidise any other, state subsidised investment in that area. So when they're effectively progressed their plans, there was no choice but to sign a commitment deal. But I mean, they said back in 2015, before this ever was a contract notice was ever issued, AIR had said from, I think it was the summer of 2015, when they were finished with their urban investment rollout programme, they were going to move on to these 300,000 premises. And it looks to me, from talking to different people, that maybe there was a calculation on the department side that was maybe a bluff or some way of just, trying to insert themselves in there, and that they were effectively calling AIR's bluff by then going ahead with the full tender. And then once AIR followed through with their plans and talked to the commission, DG Comp with the commission or whatever, there's simply no choice. A commitment deal has to be signed if they're going to go and invest as a private operator in that intervention area.
Thank you.
Senator Joe O'Reilly.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our guests, and also thank you for your briefing document. In your document and in your presentation, you've put considerable focus on the ownership of the network, and that's reasonable. And in your extensive submission, you refer to schools and road projects a lot. You know, you use them as a kind of a benchmark from previous experience. Now, in your analysis, have you applied the same assumptions to this fibre broadband network that you might have applied to a school or a hospital? Have you the kind of same assumptions applied? So, and breaking this down, what lifespan does fibre wire have? Basically, what's the lifespan? How does that compare to the lifespan of a school or a hospital? And to that extent, are they valid comparisons? And where is the value of the comparison? What is the value of fibre when it sits on the rented air poles? What precise value of it? What value will this fibre have? Now, the people out there, the taxpayers of the country, these are very pertinent, real, practical questions they'd like answers to. What value will this fibre have after 25 years and 25 Irish winters? What would the depreciated value of this fibre and communications infrastructure be after 25 years? In other words, what end product would we have after the 25 years? With the KPMG analysis of its other values is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the physical value of the infrastructure. To what extent will reinvestment in the network be necessary at 25 years to keep be necessary then, keeping in mind the lifespan? What level of a reinvestment will then be necessary for the next 10 years, say up to the 35-year mark? What kind of investment do you envisage? I think that's a very key question, in my humble opinion. Now, while some maintenance work might be required in a small school or a hospital, using the analogy with the schools and hospitals, at year 25, much more significant replacement of fibre and telecommunications infrastructure could be required. So to that extent, the comparison is a bit hairy there. The Minister, now moving on, the Minister has said that he estimated the turnover of National Broadband Ireland would reach about 150 million at its peak. That's his projected figure. Now, that's 1/10 of the current size of the current turnover of air. That's 1/10. So it's 1/10 of the current turnover of air. Now, KPMG suggested it could be lower than 150 million. Do you think this is a valuable asset for the state to own after 25 years? In other words, is there any, is it, as it's a great popular notion and populist kind of a concept to get out there and people identify with this kind of stuff, that it'll be something, we're missing something great to the state in 25 years. And I'd like a little bit of a quantifying of that in the context of those figures that the Minister proposes. Now, and moving on, have you considered, and I know there's a...
Do you want to get questions? There's a lot of questions there, Senator. Have you taken note of them all?
Yeah, if you ask, I'll repeat any one of them and I can come back. But I thought, with your permission, Chair, I'd finish them. And if not, if you think, Chair,
you can keep track of your questions being answered.
I could have taken them one by one, but I was assuming a high level of capacity of these gentlemen. So hey, much greater. So have you considered the success or not of the gap funded model used for broadband in the UK and Scotland? Have you looked at how the gap funding model or the gap funded model worked there? I think that's a very valid comparative study. In fact, it's the most valid, if you like, if we were doing comparative studies. And now, a previous witness told us here at the committee that in the UK, that BT initially assessed a 20% take-up in the early years of the service, that they had 20% take-up in the early years. But the actual take-up was in fact 40%. And this resulted in the government being able to have a clawback over years, to claw back in fact a total of 700 million. So is it not a series of, is not a series of clawbacks a good protection for the state? And, you know, is that not worth getting for the state, and doesn't it outweigh anything that you might talk about a reversion of the asset at that point? Isn't that a far more significant thing that we'd be getting that claw back? I personally believe, and it's intuitive and instinctive, and it's based on my own professional background and on just anecdotal evidence and just observation, I think the demand will go up and up and up exponentially for the service. I think we're only at, it's a bit like the initial electric light. I did a bit of history in the past, and initially the electric light, there was almost a fear of it, and there was a limited take-up, and then it went just skyrocketed, and only a total flat earths and people on the margins of society through various social vulnerabilities were the only people left not with electricity at the end of the process. And I expect a similar process here, but that's there we're in the business of a kind of a crystal ball gazing. But based on the UK experience, could we not have an optimism around that and an optimism around the clawback? So if you want me to go back over any of those, I will, but I know well you have them. So, and there, I think every one of those questions, there's a taxpayer wants to know, or we'd be asked.
If you just take note as well, Senator, because I didn't actually write them all down, so you can keep track of your own answers here. Yeah,
yes,
thank you. In any order you wish, if you want to come in on those.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. I will do my best to answer some of the earlier questions that you asked. I'm not sure I'll answer every single one of them. So we, in our briefing note, we did discuss other PPPs like schools, roads, etc. The real reason for bringing them into our discussion was because in those cases, as you know, the state, ownership is handed over to the state at the end of the contractual.
May I, with respect there, this is the nub of my question. I would humbly suggest, as a layperson, that that's not a valid comparison by virtue of their longevity, by virtue of the nature of their capacity to go on, a school or a hospital. You know,
sure. I do know. I understand.
And the product over time. I don't think they're valid, with respect. Like.
No, but what I try to do is try to explain why we did bring them into the statement,
please,
and that was simply because the justification for the gap funding model, okay, was that the ownership. If the ownership was stayed with the private sector, that would help drive the subsidy down. Because at when they went through the different ownership options, there were initially 5 ownership options on the table, but the detailed analysis was of just 2. One was the DBFOM, and the other was the gap funding model. Okay, the DBFOM is design, build, finance, operate, maintain. That's like the schools and the roads. And the key difference between the two of them is the ownership of the asset at the end. Okay, and the reason.
And then you will come with respect to what that would be.
But the reason the gap funding model was recommended in the KPMG ownership report was that there would be value. It would increase the value to the bidder, which in turn would help drive down the subsidy and the cost. Okay, and that was the reason they went for the gap funding model. In relation to ownership of. That's why we brought it in, just for the purpose of comparison.
Okay.
In relation to the question of ownership of network infrastructure, I take on board a number of the points that you actually made, but I am always mindful of the experience with the Eircom privatisation. And by virtue of the decision made back then to divest of the full state ownership of vital telecoms infrastructure, we wouldn't be here today if that decision hadn't been made. Governments should be extremely careful, okay, about giving up vital network infrastructure, be it like roads infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure, electricity infrastructure. And for that reason alone, I would be very, very loath to recommend to a government that they opt for something like the gap funding model, not only because, given the points that we made, that the justification for that isn't very strong, but the whole idea of giving up vital network infrastructure is not necessarily in the strategic interest of any country. So that's how I'd respond to those 2 points, essentially.
Yeah, and then you might come to the subset questions as to the value of the fibre and the value of the fibre at the end of the process, in net terms.
The figures they're assuming in terms of the value of the fibre, we don't know. I mean, they've obviously come up with a residual value. The figure has been redacted in terms of what the value of this network will be. If the residual value of the network will be higher in the future, as it turns out, well, then there's a clawback to the state. Of course, but we don't know what that estimated residual value is. In terms of the lifespan, you asked, I think, a series of questions around the lifespan of fibre. I remember Deputy Ryan asked this as well. I think of Comreg, and the honest answer is I don't think people yet know what the actual full lifespan of fibre will be. I think Comreg applied a 20-year lifespan in terms of their depreciation rates. Some industry guys say it could be 25 years, it could be 40 years. At some stage, yes, the fibre will have to be replaced. The optical, equipment, the active technology has to be refreshed.
Would the balance, though, not be that it's Kirk at 25, 30, 35? That there are very few suggesting it would have any value afterwards, are there? Is there any technical suggestion that would have any value?
There will be. Of course, there'll be value. Now,
there'll be value, but yeah.
Of course, there will. But they have to keep refreshing the optical technology. I mean, that develops rapidly, rapidly enough in terms of the active equipment that they'll use to transmit light down the fibre. That has to be refreshed every. You can sweat it a bit if you want, but I would have thought 7 to 10 years max. It would have to be refreshed. That must be built in. But all of these things can be built into a contract anyway.
Can you just explain that again to me? Sorry, just the bit about the light going into the cable, the refreshing, the 7 to 9 years bit. Yeah,
the optical equipment. I'm not a telecoms engineer. I won't be able to explain it very well, but I do know that the optical equipment that they use to light the fibre,
to send the
exactly
refracting
does need to be refreshed as technology develops over time. So the current technology maybe can handle up to.
Would that not suggest that after 25 years, what's the net value to the state then after 25, 30 years?
It's very hard to tell because you don't know how the active equipment itself, the optical technology will develop over the next 25 years.
Oh, I know.
We don't know how. Maybe the fibre
will not become obsolete if you get new technology. What I'm trying to say is there any real value?
Fibre, speed of light is a fairly fast speed. I don't know if obviously maybe something can come in the future.
And what about the winters? What about the effect of the weather and the winters on the fibre in terms of it?
Again, under current estimates, they still think that it could at least have a lifespan of 25 years, but even the manufacturers.
But you're still back, and you're back to the 25. So effectively, you're saying that's what I'm trying to nail is the populist argument that some way the state is foregoing some big asset, and that it's recklessly letting something off that's valuable. The truth is that after the span, and that for the subsequent 10 years to reach the 35, it'll be. There's nothing in it for the state other than hopefully a clawback from a better take-up than we anticipated.
Just on the same point, if I could, Chair, maybe when that's completed, just a slight variation on that.
Yeah, I'll show then. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, well, do you want to take that and then
take
that, please, and then we take the variation?
Look, again, I mean, there has to be some kind of residual value here. It will not be a worthless asset in 25 years or 35 years.
No, but there's nothing to suggest it will be a very valuable asset either.
It could well be.
It's purely speculative.
How can anybody, especially with this?
I could win the prize bonds then too, the way.
Exactly.
So, it's speculative basically.
Yes, just to clarify that, would you accept that the real asset value in this entire endeavour is the unique access, the unfettered access, if you want, to that 542,000 premises, and the fact that the company concerned will in essence be paid to build up that pool of customers who will pay at current rates €30 a month, so that the value, rather than just what's the cost of the piece of cable or whatever, it's actually the monopoly access which is being supported to build that pool of customers that will really drive the future valuation. Now, if memory serves me, the department's proposal is, our expectation is that 80% of that 542,000 premises by the end of the life cycle, well, actually after about 10 years actually, will have signed up to the network. So therefore, that's the value.
Yeah. Taking Deputy Dooley's point there, that taking that as its value, it's good that we've nailed the concept that it has some intrinsic value, but taking that as its value, would you accept then that the clawback will achieve the taxpayers' requirements from that, assuming a high level of take-up, as they had in the UK? When Deputy Dooley was out of the room, I was just remembering that in the UK, BT anticipated 20% take-up of the service. In fact, it was 40%. So, and I personally believe that, and I was drawing an analogy with the electric light in your absence, Deputy Dooley, that in fact, through the chair, I think that this thing will, we're only at the margins of this. This thing will take off, and in a huge way.
And just
Go ahead.
and would you also accept that the way the contract seems to be structured, right from the start, that the more investment that the company makes through investing in a network, that they'll end up owning after the 20 years. So if they load heavily investment at a certain period of time, it will reduce to a big extent the clawback to the state. So those clawbacks are meant to ensure that the contractor continues to invest in the network that they will ultimately own. So whilst the clawback sounds good, in essence, it has never really been in there to come back to the state. It has been a methodology, if you want, of ensuring that the contractor doesn't cream off the profits.
Yes, but we'll still be keeping the infrastructure renewed with it, of course.
Yeah, but
I would take. I think you're trying to say maybe in the run down to the end of the contract, your incentive as the operator to reinvest in it, if you know you're going to walk away, is going to be, I would say, fairly minimal. You're not going to be trying to increase the residual value so that the state can then take a big chunk of that back. I would have thought, yeah, you'd be trying to sweat the asset as much as you can towards the very...
You'd also want to sell it, wouldn't you? If you're going to leave it, wouldn't you want to have something to sell?
They'll have made all their money back. If you read the deeper report, they'll have made everything back by 7 or 8 years. So anything after that is additional to them. On the whole asset, though, I think one thing that's we had in our briefing note that is a concern is just the huge reliance on AIR's infrastructure in the intervention area. So AIR have a major infrastructure program that they're going to have to implement, where they have to obviously make ready all the poles and the ducts. That's part of the reason why KPMG said it's now gone to a 7-year rollout time frame. And the big question then would be, what happens if there's any kind of delay in that? Where does the risk lie? What's AIR's incentive to deliver on that? If they don't deliver, if there's a delay, is it the BuildCo, is it NBPco, or are the subcontractors on the hook? Who takes on that risk in terms of not being able to deploy?
But I mean, you can do this, we can all say what happens if the ice age returns, or if there's a tornado this evening, or an earthquake, of course, and that's an interesting kind of speculative thing. But the question, what would the alternative be? I mean, what was the alternative to using the AIR infrastructure?
The alternative to using it? I'm not saying that I think it's good to reuse existing infrastructure. They could either use the ESB's infrastructure or AIR's infrastructure, or build their own. Obviously, if there's existing infrastructure, you should make sure you utilise it as much. I mean, maybe down the line they could use some of the ESB's. A lot of this comes down to regulation as well, in terms of the CRU would have to make a determination on the valuation of mass energy versus telecoms here. But
I sense that you make criticism of it that anyone could make, in a sense, and I'm not for a minute suggesting you don't have an expertise, far from it, but that these are things that anyone, the man in the bar, could say. But the man in the bar could say, ought to not work. We should have kept it, be a great asset. There won't be the take-up, the clawback. The company will exploit the clawback thing and they'll ensure there's no clawback. You could say that about anything. You could similarly say about the school, to go back to the school or the hospital. Actually, they'll build the school badly, and the private side will be a badly built school, and all of that.
Yeah, thanks. We've been indicating for a while.
And I know you're coming in, but I think it was on this thread, wasn't it?
Yeah, just if I could go in on that. Just the comparison with the rural electrification is not a valid comparison, because there's only one company going to supply electricity to your house, and that was Electricity Supply Board. Whereas in this case, the difficulty with this is not the case, is that not alone is the risks in terms of the take-up, in terms of who will want it, but the field is already, in some cases, 3/4 full. I was in a townland the other evening where there's 56 houses, and 40 have just been served in the last month or two, serviced in the last month or two by a private operator via a radio signal. And just with this, I'm fascinated with this discussion about what's worth after 25 years. The government are telling us, and the department tells us, and the people defending this process tells us that there's built-in obligations to keep the technology and to keep the fibre up to scratch. And I'll make the comparison with the motorways. The motorways are on a 25-year, they're to come back to the state after 25 years. This doesn't come back to the state. But if you don't resurface the motorway every 2 years, and if you don't maintain it, and if you don't look after the drainage on it, right, you won't get much of a motorway back. So they have to be maintained. But the huge difference is that the taxpayers' buy-in was less. And I wouldn't be happy with the contract. Some of them, particularly the one for the N7, it's a bit dodgy, I think, anyway. Not dodgy in the sense of anybody setting out to do anything wrong, but the terms of it weren't good for the taxpayer. But with this, I mean, is somebody trying to say that, like, I'll paint you another example. The various private companies that have flipped air over the last 20 years since it was privatised, that was sold recently. That was sold to a French investor recently, who paid billions of euros for it, despite the fact half the poles are falling over in the ditches. So to say that a telecommunications network or a broadband network would not be worth something and very valuable at the end of 25 years, I think is ridiculous, particularly if we were to take on board what the government have told us about the compulsory mechanisms that are built into this contract to ensure that the investor and that the operator will maintain and upgrade and renew cables and do everything else over the 25 years. We're looking at a very, very valuable network here. And to add to that, what Deputy Dooley said, the fact that it has the customer base cornered in that 540,000 intervention area, the fact that it has that and the operation and the supply of that, this makes this a very valuable asset after 25 years.
Do you want to point out any of that, or well, I'm going?
But that's my
sorry,
intention.
Senator O'Reilly, you finished?
Yes. Is the after the 25 years, or assuming for a moment that, what's your assessment really of the clawback? How do you think it has enough teeth? Do you think it will work?
Well, we don't know exactly what I think is it 60% of the residual value? I think there's so many different clawbacks built in. I can't remember, is this one 60% or 100% or 50% above it? But there is a clawback, I think, of anything over the agreed residual value in the contract. Yeah, anything above that.
And would you say that will achieve? Yeah. Do you see that as effective?
It's obviously it gets you something back, but I'd kind of go back to the point that if you knew you were going to walk away, would you really want to make sure that the residual value was at any higher?
There's no absolute sure. They hardly will want to walk away from a good product. I mean, nobody's going to want to abandon something of this value. Do you know what I mean? Of this scale. And if they did walk away themselves and they can't flip within the contract, they can't flip in a short term, but assuming that after so many years they could flip, that they could be bought over, the person buying them over would have a commercial imperative and an imperative to their bankers to keep it going. I mean, you might as well say that the people who own the Shelbourne Hotel could walk away someday and run it down in the interim. They're going to want the Shelbourne Hotel in a state that they can move it on. And the people who take it will have bankers making sure they keep it right. And I would have thought the same would apply here.
Can I just in considering the fact that what was at stake at the beginning was a choice between different ownership models, and so if one was the design, build, operate, finance model, okay, as per, we'll say, as in roads, that's the exact same, okay, as the gap funding model, insofar as the incentives will be built into the contract to make sure that the asset was maintained, and at the end of the contractual period, it would be handed back in a state that was fit for purpose. Okay, the only reason, really, not the main reason for operating, for using the gap funding model, okay, was for a different set of considerations, which is to drive the subsidy down, because the winning bidder, it was expected, would exploit the advantages of owning the infrastructure in the long term.
Which isn't available.
Okay, but the models are very similar when it comes to the question of maintenance and the condition of the asset when it's handed back.
But they are controlled.
You're finished, Senator O'Reilly, with your questioning. You have them all answered. Okay, Deputy Kate O'Connell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Chair. To follow on from those questions, so there's really two schools of thought. You have an asset after 25 years that you neglect, you sweat the asset, you get the value out of it and you leave a bad cable, or you invest in it and you sell something worth value. So really what you're saying here today is, or maybe I'm misinterpreting you, that of those two schools of thought, the first one of letting sweat the living life out of the asset, get as much money back, and then have a defunct cable. Is that what you're saying is the more likely outcome? And if it is, how can you say that?
Not saying it would be the most likely outcome, but if...
Of the two outcomes,
if you knew as an operator that there was a big refresh that's going to be needed, so new active equipment and maybe replacing fibre, because maybe that fibre could last 40 years and that's after your 35 years are up, and fine, and maybe they'd be okay on that. But if you knew when your potential exit date is, I would have thought that, if you might try and avoid some of that future, some of that OPEX and CAPEX, especially if a lot of that gets clawed back.
It's your personal opinion that would be, I'm really trying, because this is really important, because it's a subject of huge debate publicly. So there are, to my mind, from the conversations we've had and the extensive questioning, two options: valuable asset, fit for purpose, updated. You mentioned earlier on, the technology been put in now was more advanced than day one. So just let's say they do all the investment, everything works out great. We're not going to find faster than light transmission. We'll take that perhaps today at the committee. Fibre optic is the way forward. It just depends on the thickness and the insulation of the cable itself. So of the two options I've put you today, or we've discussed today, defunct asset or fabulous gold standard asset. You're telling me your expert opinion is that it will be a defunct asset at the end.
I'm not saying it will be a defunct.
And what are you saying?
I'm saying that
I don't find it funny now, sorry, by the way.
I'm not saying that. I'm
okay.
saying in terms of the residual value that's agreed, there is a residual value that's going to be agreed in this contract. There will be a clawback for anything in that value above all that. If you look at how the gap funding model works, and even it came out yesterday in the report on the National Broadband Scheme, where there is economic value in an asset at the end of the contract, when it's gone back over to private ownership, the Indicon report says that should then lower the amount of subsidy required. The higher that economic value is...
Of the residual asset? Yes.
At the end of whatever your term of contract is, the higher the economic value of that asset is, the lower the state subsidy should be, because you're obviously giving ownership over a very valuable asset.
The lower as you go through the process. Sorry.
Yeah, but at the end of that contract, if that's a very valuable asset that they have...
But we don't know the value of it, that's my point.
But this is,
that's my question to you.
Yeah,
sorry, my question to you is, because I gave you I'm trying to sum up here. Two options: defunct asset or gold standard modern asset. Forget the gap, forget all of that. Where do you see it? You're an expert brought in here to inform us. Where do you see it, in your opinion, ending up? Defunct asset
I'd never say defunct. You
Okay,
can't say
worn out,
defunct.
sweated was the word. You said sweated the
Yeah,
asset.
obviously everything depends on future take-up, technological
So really it's
developments,
purely
market developments.
speculative what you've said.
But I would say so were they in terms of coming up with a residual value. Everybody is speculating here.
Through the chair, I think we've got to be careful here. We've advised, no, with respect, this is a point of order. We have asked Mr. Reeves and Mr. Patrick to come in to talk about a procurement process and give us their views around PPPs and how they might be better structured. There's nearly, with respect, there's a level, a line of questioning here that, quite frankly, wouldn't be tolerated in general terms.
No, in
I'm
fairness,
just a bit concerned that
deputies and senators are trying to get clarification, and when witnesses come before our committee, I think these are valid questions, and this is a very this is a very important issue. We're coming in here to try and analyse, and yes, it's a robust discussion. I'm sure you don't have any objection, or is there any objection to this? No. And I think we need to have a robust and challenging questions, and some of these we won't know the answer to some of them. I'm just speaking in generalities, and we don't expect you to have definitive answers, but you're here to give your professional opinion where you can, and if you can't, that's absolutely fine. We all accept that.
I do apologise if you're finding that I don't think you're sorry. I don't mean to be difficult. I'm just trying to get to the answers here because there's been a lot of to and froing. You know, if there's any issue, please, through the chair, correct me.
I don't think you're giving binary choice here, one or the other. I don't think actually the point has been made that there's any guarantee that the investor is going to sweat the asset and run. We didn't actually make that statement. That wasn't in our opening statement. It wasn't in our detailed brief. So the truth is, we actually don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen in terms of changing technology, in terms of the value of the asset at the end of the day. No one ever said that we did know. Okay. It's up to the people who are involved in the contract to do their best to try and factor this into the agreement. And of course the problem is that what is in the agreement, okay, will actually be set in stone to a degree, and that's one of the downsides of using a PPP type model, is that you lose a bit of flexibility, okay, when there's lock-in to a 25-year contract. Okay, that's another thing that we didn't mention.
But in terms of where this ends up... Sorry.
Professor,
but there will be contractual provisions, as we know, to ensure that the asset is maintained up to the, within the period of contract, and that's as far as anybody's looking. They're looking at a 25-year period. In relation to whether it's worth anything in 25 years, you don't know, I don't know, and neither does the department know. We can't simply answer the question. But nobody is suggesting, we haven't suggested it, nobody else that I'm aware of suggested that there is an incentive for the operator to sweat the asset or to run the asset down. They might have an incentive at some point to exploit the value of the asset and to sell it. That happens. Okay, that happens in PPP contracts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be issues in terms of the service quality for the users. Okay, the question then is actually what it becomes then is a question about who is extracting value. Where does the value actually go? Okay, and the problem with the Eircom privatisation was, okay, and I've referred to this already, is that the true value was the true value, and it was exactly what we're talking about here was relevant in that case. The true value of the network infrastructure that we privatised in 1999 was only realised when it was flipped, not once, not twice, but 3, maybe 4 times. Okay? And the question then is, and that's maybe what you may have detected from some of our points, the question is where, and it's a distributional question, who extracted the value? Okay? And in that case, the value was extracted by private equity groups, okay, abroad, okay? And as I said earlier, we wouldn't be here today discussing the broadband plan and how do we actually address the market failure that arose as a result of the botched privatisation in 1999.
So that's where I was going next on it. So you compared it to Eircom and you explained it very well to us. So I suppose Eircom, and you've done a lot of work on it, was poles and cable attached to it and the ground around it as such. But that's gone now and we can't reverse it. I know it's regrettable, obviously. We could really do it to attach these cables to, but we are where we are today. But so I suppose this is a vital infrastructure like electricity, but it's not really comparable to Eircom because What we're dealing with here is the infrastructure as a cable, but with Eircom it was the pole and the cable. So it was the entire sort of pathway through the country was Eircom, where this isn't comparable. Well,
I mean, you just described it yourself, really. The comparison only goes so far.
Yes, it only sort of half story.
Literally, yeah, exactly.
Top half or bottom
it
half.
only goes so far. It's poles, cables, ducts.
Yeah, so it's not really comparable then.
It's comparable to a point.
Yeah.
But I think you've actually almost answered your own question.
Yeah, no, I was just making sure I hadn't misinterpreted. So then also at the opening, it was the Eircom post. So I think it was yourself mentioned the duplication of the fibre. But it's not really duplication because, or maybe I have it wrong, the air poles already, or they will be providing the poles, now maybe I have it wrong, the poles with the cable on it already. So this is leasing it off them as an entity rather than just the cable.
No, they're overlaying their own fibre over Eir's fibre.
They're overlaying it on top, okay.
Yeah.
And will there be any cutting into will they be able to, I suppose, bridge both ends? So will Eir have any control over the overall loop, as it were? That makes sense.
Eir will have their own separate network in the tree.
Within?
Yeah, well, connecting to their own network, I'm sure, their national network. NBP Co or NBI, they'll be overlaying their fibre in that 300,000 area. Now, I think Deputy Dooley asked earlier, would you have any state aid concerns around that in terms of, it's meant to just be obviously passing through the exclusion zone to get to the intervention area. And would there be any concerns maybe that they could then maybe try and connect premises within the exclusion zone? I mean, obviously that's technically not allowed in the exclusion zone, but the fact that, the department had assumed that they would rent Eir's fibre, they signed a commitment deal with Eir to roll out fibre in the 300,000 home area, premises area. I think the department's budget model then assumed that the winning bidder would effectively rent the fibre, use Eir's wholesale active product.
Yeah,
but now they're not. There's a much higher cost to what they're doing.
So maybe I have it wrong, but originally we're renting a pole with a cable on it off Eir.
Yeah.
And what you're saying now, the pole and the cable is there to service Eir's own people, and we're layering it on top.
Yeah.
So were you suggesting that we should have used the existing Eir? Was that what you were suggesting earlier?
The department's own budget model assumed that would be the case, yeah. So effectively all we want to know really, all we should be told really is what would the comparative cost of not deploying a parallel fibre network in a very extensive area. There's a big time frame to do that, there's a big cost to do that, that's a lot of capex. What would just the comparative cost of renting or using Eir's active product on the same
And just
phone
on that point, just let's say we'd done that,
Yeah.
and let's say Eir was sold again, just, again, like Eircom, sorry, just let's say it was sold again. How would that have been for the Irish taxpayer, if, in your view, or maybe I don't have a view, if we had gone with that model, which wasn't the overlaying of cable, if Eir had control over those 300,000 and the connectivity, and Eir was sold? How would that have played out for the people of Ireland if it was an integral part of the network that could have been pulled out of it? Has that been considered? I'm just thinking the option that they're going with is better in terms of...
As far as I understand your question, I don't think it would really matter because the Eir would be sold. It would have a different nameplate really on the company, but they would still own the network, still using it and selling the same products.
Yeah, but
and those products would be regulated. The prices would be regulated by Comreg.
There's nothing to say that if Eir had been sold and with this position of the 300,000 being serviced, that the company that bought it would have had the same priorities. It could have just been a small part of their overall... See do you get what I'm getting at? You're assuming that the company, this theoretical company, would have had the same model. But just if they didn't, that would have taken 300,000 houses out of, I suppose, the priority for broadband in terms of a company's vision. It could potentially have.
I'm kind of confused because I'm not sure about... Sometimes I'm not sure if you're talking about, since Eir took the 300,000 houses out.
Sorry. No, what I'm challenging is...
now or in a few years' time?
What I'm challenging is that if it had been done, that Eir provided to the 300,000 with their own cable, nothing to do with the NBP people, that they were like just a part of the solution. So we reused the cable they already have, and they were part of the whole solution to broadband. What if Eir, who had a control over those 300,000 homes had been sold because they're a private company, and that company decided to specialise now in electric cars. Not to worry about that. How would that have fared out? The idea that we could just have used a chunk of a private company's network, would that not have been high risk for the state?
I mean, it's a regulated entity in terms of its wholesale services, so anyone else who come in and maybe took ownership of that, they would still be regulated in the same way. I mean, all we are questioning is,
somebody purchasing this would be similarly
Okay, I'm going to Senator O'Reilly, please let Dr. Palcic finish.
all we are questioning is, what would the comparative cost that the department assumed of renting the Ayres fibre in the 300,000 premises area have been in terms of cost as compared to the additional cost? And we've been told it's a significant additional cost of the winning bidder rolling out their own fibre, overlaying Ayres' existing fibre in the 300,000 premises area. It's just a point of comparison that we're looking for to see.
Yeah,
and what justifies, why would Ayres' product not be dependable? I can't remember which company was here at the time, and maybe it was Analysis Mason, and said something about maybe that they had the view that Ayres' product wouldn't be dependable. They didn't really get into huge detail on it, but what are the precise reasons why Ayres' fibre wouldn't be good enough, and that Granite and McCourt need to overlay that fibre with their own fibre in the 300,000 premises exclusion area?
For us, this is a big question that needs to be answered. Like, one of the big issues for all of us is trying to understand, why did the subsidy go up from 787 million to something, to plus another billion? Okay, and it appears. Analysis Mason mentioned this last week when they were here in front of the committee, and the penny dropped with a lot of us that, this is what's going on. One of the reasons the cost is going up is because they've decided to actually overlay their own cable on the air network within the 300,000 area that they took out. So, I mean, this goes back to your original, but that's what they're actually doing.
Yes,
okay?
that's
so.
Yeah.
We have, we as independent commentators have our eyebrows raised, and we're wondering, why is this happening? Does it make sense to duplicate the existing network?
Yeah, and I totally get that.
We don't know, and we don't know. But when Analysis Mason were here last week, they could have been maybe probed a bit more deeply to try and understand, why do they not have confidence in Ayres products? We don't know the answer, but what we do know is that it seems to have been a major driver of the huge amount of the increase in the subsidy that the taxpayer is going to pay.
But the point that I make is, yes, obviously, duplicating and overlaying obviously would have had a cost impact.
Yeah.
But my point is, to the final solution for the whole point of this is to roll out broadband to all of Ireland. If you had all these moving parts, but if you had not overlaid on the air poles, you were at risk of leaving 300,000 families that were under the air, under their intervention area, that they could have been pulled out
that does not appear to have been the assumption of the department at any stage. But I would imagine, and it's a point I made in my opening statement, this would have happened once we got down to one bidder. And for me, this is a suspicion, because we don't have full facts. But when you're down to one bidder, well, then the bidder, is in a very strong position. They can say, you know what, we won't actually go with the original plan, which is just to use the poles and the ducts. We'll actually overlay our own cable. There's advantages in them for doing that, okay, because the subsidy is based on the capex. So they get a bigger subsidy and they build a much higher quality network for themselves, and hopefully down the line, going back to a lot of the issues that we were talking about earlier, we don't know what's going to happen down the line, but they will be able to exploit that value for a longer period. This is the problem with having a competition, having a procurement with no competition.
Thank you.
Senator O'Reilly and Deputy Stanley and Deputy Dooley wanted to come in. I know it was related on the last. I just wanted to keep that thread of thought going and let Deputy O'Connell finish her questioning. Senator O'Reilly.
I'll come back in later. Leave it.
Okay.
Deputy O'Connell asked the question.
Okay, that's perfect. Deputy Stanley.
Just two related questions. Yeah. One is in relation to the value what Ayre was sold for. Ayre was sold for a significant sum. There was a figure of 4 billion. He mentioned at one stage, and you may be able to clarify that. And that network had very little investment in it over the 20-year period, nearly 2 decades since privatisation. and very little cable replaced, and it was out in every Irish winter, some very severe since then. The problem, it had what you would call a distribution, or I would call it, connectivity, connection value, but also had an infrastructure value, despite the fact that it needs a lot of upgrading and repair. And you might just clarify that if you know the actual sale price, that you can remind us of that. The other issue the other question I wanted to ask is this: surely the real question here is that when Air was not the successful bidder, and when the competition went out of it and they exited, and I believe they had what they needed at that stage, they got what they wanted. They got 240,000 households and premises, easy to reach ones, and they said thank you very much. And that the real issue here is that we're getting into whether you overlay, the whole thing is bananas, the fact that you're overlaying fibre that's already there, which was going to happen. I said they would act as a bit like Dick Turpin on the highway. You won't pass us unless you pay. So then you have to go around them, or you have to overlay another system on theirs, and then you pay. And the real issue here that Deputy O'Connell was missing was that the taxpayer has to pay a subsidy for each pole each year and for each metre of cable that they run fibre through. That is the real issue here, because we're going with this model of using one private company to use the network of another private company, and Joe and Mary Soap is going to subsidise the whole thing, and which ties in completely into the cost escalation, which as you said has gone from 0.8 of a billion to what it is now. But the other factor in driving the cost up, is it not, the fact that we are now in the situation where 1 billion of the 3 billion of taxpayers' money is going to be handed over, has to be handed to a separate private company by the investor to allow them to use their infrastructure. Is that not the real, that plus the overlay within the air intervention area, the air controlled area, is that not the real deal here in terms of driving the cost from an estimated between half a billion and 1 billion to now 3 billion for the taxpayer? And the fact that that has to be paid for each pole, each metre out ducting has now to be subsidised. It's not as if Air is saying to us we can use it, just overlay and it's all right. The taxpayer has to pay for this each year with this crazy scheme that's now being designed.
Take the rental.
No, on the Air.
Your first question, I can't remember what the price Air was sold at. The most recent sale, it was 3.5 billion. Is
Yes.
in my head for some reason.
Yes. So it was a very, very valuable asset.
Yeah, but I mean,
and those cables were, some of those cables were 30-year-old.
Yeah, but I mean, in fairness, Air has a substantial wholesale operation business. It's got a retail business. It's got mobile. It's involved in a lot of other things beyond just a wholesale broadband operator. It has obviously invested in recent years in fibre rollout in mainly urban areas and now in the 300,000 premises area. So, it may be. Of course, there are parts of rural Ireland that where poles are falling down, like you mentioned earlier, and things like that. So it hasn't been massive investment, but it's involved in so many other things that the value was obviously a very, very different situation there. I think what you're asking around, Air took 300,000 premises out of the area. That obviously had an impact in terms of competitive tension, the cost of subsidy, etc. A lot of that subsidy is going to renting, the actual poles and ducts, and then the additional cost that we're seeing now. I think that would have always been there, but the additional cost that we're seeing now, once we're down to one bidder, is the overlaying that you're talking about, and that's increasing subsidy even further.
The reason I raised the point, Cairo, is that if the ESB network was used, there's also another parallel network called ESB infrastructure that's there, that's already carrying fibre in some areas, that if that had to be used, the taxpayer would not be paying €20 per pole to rent it, to hang the cables on. That's my point.
It would depend on, I would imagine it would depend on what the CRU would determine the price should be.
But if the ESB was doing it, or a model attached to the ESB?
Again, there might be an issue around how they do cost separation in their accounts between their energy division and a telecoms division, and what the price that the COU or Comreg in conjunction with them would say should be charged for access to that product. It might have to be brought under regulation.
Easier deal with themselves than a French investor, though.
Okay. Deputy Dooley, did you want to come in?
Very much. Would you accept, there's a lot of unknowns here, and I think you're trying to look at it from what's going to happen in 20, 25 years' time. But in terms of the best protection from the state's perspective, would you accept that full state ownership is the best way to ensure that the state is protected into the future, considering that there's a relatively low level of private capital being invested versus the very significant amounts of money that the state has been invested? We were all of the view here that burden sharing, risk sharing would ultimately be carried by a third party, by the private sector, so that all that risk into the future, what the state lost was effectively the long-term potential, but on the basis of the medium-term, the risk was elsewhere, and therefore lower subsidy, and therefore that made sense. So in a nutshell, that has been turned on its head. We've 230 capital coming in, or 220. It's not even. I think maybe it's 170 capital, and there's some, actual capital coming in, and then there's some working capital which will be paid back together with dividends and interest and all of that good stuff, which, before we'll really know the success or otherwise of this venture, based on Mr. Watt's communication, will already have been recouped by the bidder. So the risk really remains with the state throughout, and in return for the risk, they really have no potential upside. Isn't that the case?
I'll try and answer that question as best I can. Ideally, the answer to that question should have been given, as accurately as possible in the ownership report that was published at the end of 2015. I read the report then. I read it again in preparation for today, and I can't get away from the conclusion that this state-owned model was dismissed too easily. The arguments were not very convincing, and the corollary to that was that a huge degree of faith was put in the PPP approach, which, as it turns out, is always more complicated than often anticipated at the beginning. But this is generally, there is a constituency that believes in a more private sector-led approach. But basic economic theory will tell you, in such complex projects, where there's huge degrees of uncertainty around issues like technology, it's almost a common sense thing. Economics sometimes is a common sense subject, sometimes. But it would suggest that the solution will be somewhere towards the state model, closer to the state-owned model and away from the market-based model, because in circumstances like that, essentially, the market doesn't work well. Markets don't work well when there's huge uncertainty, when there's great complexity and so on. And this is exactly what we see playing out. So the answer to your question, yes, I do think the state would be better protected with a state-owned model, and that should have been the choice that was made at the beginning.
And there's really no financial benefit for going the other way, because the state is carrying such a huge chunk of the cost. Just on the 300,000, I just want to go back on that. Just, would you accept that if as has been suggested, that the notion of overlaying the fibre was to protect the future demands of the 300,000 that are already in that intervention area, that in fact, if any consideration was given to that as a reason for this additional cost, it would breach the state aid rules, because there's already an incumbent there. So therefore, any further provision of taxpayers' money to future-proof, if you want, the 300,000 would in fact be a breach of state aid rules.
Yeah, and it's fairly clear that they're not allowed in any way connect to a premise within that exclusion zone. That would be definitely contravening state. It's basically they're on their way through and nothing else, passing through in order to get to the intervention area.
Just then to address one, and the final point of that then, to address the future potential or the future value, the fact that they would have a cable and have an arrangement to go through that area opens up opportunities once you're out of contract in 25 or 30 years' time, and therefore creates a potential competitive environment against AIR or whoever else is there.
Once they're out of contract, that could be the case. And these things, look, it's very hard to see it. It's the complexity, I think, that Owen was talking about earlier that's key here. And in a more state-controlled, state-led approach, you're better able to deal with that complexity. When you're having to contract for all of these things in PPPs, I mean, even for, say, roads, easier infrastructure, I would say, in terms of it's a motorway, there's going to be a certain value at the end of it. That's still a complex contract, and there are a lot of complexities around it in terms of calculating value for money, the PSP, etc. In this type of contract, in a fast-moving sector, with technology changing, with competition changing, there is so much extra complexity on top of what we normally would see with a PPP that even what we were talking about earlier, what would the economic value be, the residual value be? Maybe I was being too glib if I said that it would be devolved. I'm not saying it would be, it's just what value that has. A lot of that will actually come down to the competitive process. The NBS review that came out said yesterday that the subsidy that's going to be paid is going to be a mixture of the costs, the revenues, the strategic value, and what the economic value at the end will be. And bidders are going to have to obviously come up with figures as to what they think the value will be at the end, what they think the strategic value to them of owning that asset at the end of it is, what the revenues are and what the costs are, and it's a complex interplay of those to work out, well, what's the subsidy to the government. But when you're down to one bidder and they don't have any competitive pressure to maybe be a bit more realistic on future demand and therefore revenues, to maybe attach a higher strategic value or put a higher economic value on that asset at the end of it so that the subsidy will be reduced, all of that tension is gone. And that's why when you're dealing with this type of a gap funding or PPP model, the complexity and uncertainty makes things extremely difficult.
Just a kind of concluding question, if I can, Chair, stroke comment. Given the level of given the number of unknowns and the vagueness around, and in some cases reasonable, but given the vagueness around the value of the asset after the 25 years, the likely take-up, what would happen, whether it be stress tested, whether it would be worn out or not by the company, whether they'd sell. Given all those variables, and there are variables there, is it not a bit emphatic and too strong for you to say in your second paragraph that the procurement approach adopted has not satisfied the criteria necessary to ensure value for money? How do you reach that conclusion given the level of unknowns? And that's not to say that it's theoretically possible that you could end up being correct, but there's no evidence to suggest that you're correct either. So is it not a bit emphatic to go into the public domain when you don't know, as you said, on so many elements?
I respectfully would make the point that no, it's not emphatic enough. In fact, the point was made, in relation to value for money. That's what you're asking me. The paragraph in relation to value for money. I've outlined clearly what the drivers of value for money are. They're competition, risk transfer. If you want to boil it down, they're the two elements. Sorry.
The others had pulled out of the process.
The whole point is there is no competition. So the point we're trying to make is that the gap funding model will not achieve value for money because there's no competition. And there are also concerns about the level of risk that's been transferred to the private sector. And they are the two drivers of value for money in a model like this. And in relation then to the point you're making about the unknowns, the complexities and so on, the point, and it's actually, we do make that point in the briefing note, it's infrastructure 101. In circumstances like that, the safest option, probably the one that's most economically advantageous in all respects, is to probably go for a state-led model, because within that model there will be some people would find it difficult. Some people would find it difficult to agree with the fact that a state-owned model, a state-owned enterprise, would be far more nimble and flexible than a long-term contract, which is far more rigid. And one of the downsides of the PPP model that has been shown to be the case over the last 20 years is the fact that as you go into these contracts, the costs tend to escalate because in circumstances where flexibility is required, the private sector doesn't give because they're going to stick with the contract if it's to their advantage.
Yeah.
So
just very briefly, and we'll abandon that. Because a lot of the information has come out. Just briefly, let's for a moment say your hypothesis or your proposition is that the state model would be better. Have you evaluated the state model in terms of cost inputs, in terms of getting to the sector of the community that we're trying to get to, of longevity, of maintenance, of everything? Have you done a model of that and cost-benefit analysis?
We have not done that, but KPMG, the department, they have done that. And if you read KPMG's ownership report, when they looked at the public ownership option, they said they assumed the same costs and more or less the same costs and revenues as all the other options. The key difference was some higher startup costs, because obviously then it would be a new state enterprise. But the other major difference was the strategic value that they were assuming would arise under the gap funding model. That's what they said was the difference. So they have access to all the costs and figures. We don't. Everything is redacted.
But they did say to be, what did you say?
The differentiator that KPMG highlighted were the initial startup costs, but critically also the strategic value that they assumed would arise under the gap funding model. The only difference they assumed would be the distinguishing the DBFOM and gap funding model, the PPP model versus the gap funding model. That was the only thing they referred to was step-in rights. They're included in the gap funding contract that we have here. So again, without seeing what their financial appraisal actually included and the figures they included, we can't say for certain what the things are. But based on what they have themselves stated in the document, you'd have to question a lot of the assumptions that they made.
And just to add, one other assumption that they made was that under the state-owned model, one of the disadvantages would be the absence of competition. As it turned out, there's no competition in the gap funding model anyway. So, how can one at this point argue that the state-owned model wouldn't have the same advantages as put forward for the PPP?
At the end of the day, it's all speculative.
Deputy O'Connell.
One of your wiser contributions, Senator.
Deputy O'Connell.
So I suppose leading on from that, so if just theoretically, forgetting the analysis on it, if full state ownership, that would mean you'd have to CPO land, wouldn't you? It's like it's starting again, isn't it, with Eircom essentially? What is it? How would you do that? Is it I'm talking about, currently we have these poles and we have the cable. So a state-led model, what is that? Is that owning the ground, owning the poles, owning the cable? What is it?
The simplest version would be to do exactly kind of what Granite and McCourt are doing, except it would be state-owned. So utilise existing infrastructure. What would make most sense would be, and look, they've been talking about this for well over a decade. It's been recommended since as far back as I don't know when, bundling together our existing state telecoms assets, be they Bord Gáis's, Irish Rails, everybody, bundling it all together and building out from that, or utilising existing infrastructure. I mean, they would be utilising existing infrastructure wherever possible, be that the ESBs or heirs, and only building new poles or ducts where absolutely necessary, where none exist. But the key difference would be it would be a state-owned enterprise that would be managing and delivering that process and deploying it.
So instead of Granite and McCourt doing it, you'd have an agency set up with this cost, whichever, can't be too much, and they would go to Air and have done something with them and gone to Virgin in an area.
Could be Air, ESB, it could be any operator, yeah.
So
anybody, any
purely the
infrastructure
person
owner.
at the head is the issue. And do you think the state would have been more efficient at that, or is that just another assumption? Less efficient?
I wouldn't say. I would say the state would be better able to adapt to changing market conditions and changing technological conditions, because when you're locked into very detailed contracts that are rigid over a 25, 35-year lifespan, there is no flexibility, or unless it's built into the contract. Whereas if it's a state-owned enterprise and something else gets taken out of the intervention area or gets added back in, they can adapt very easily. They can be as flexible as possible.
And Professor Reeves, you mentioned the value for money, and I just didn't get it right down. You said competition. There was two drivers, competition and something else. And what?
Risk transfer.
Risk transfer.
Optimal risk sharing, essentially, okay? But that would involve transferring more risks to the private sector than would occur under, we'll say, traditional procurement or state-owned enterprise. But that's it, really. So it's optimal risk sharing. Okay, and that is a really strong advantage of PPP if they get it right. Okay, you can't transfer too much, can't transfer too little. It's kind of stick and carrot, but it's an incentive mechanism. But they're absolutely the two main drivers. And when in their absence, the case for a kind of a PPP approach, it's gone. It's evaporated.
And in your statement, you talk about the cost-benefit methodology and you question on that. I suppose there's qualitative and quantitative assessment of things. I mean, does the CBA, as it is, or as you prefer it, would that have taken in, can you put in a factor or a figure for a value on remote working? Because to my mind, you can't quantify that now for the future. You cannot, there's no figure you can put on the person outside Skibbereen being able to sell their pottery to the man in America. There's no value you can put in the person in Portlaoise who's commuting to Dublin being able to stay 3 days a week at home. So I'm wondering, in terms of your raw analysis of the sums, have you put in a variable?
Okay, not at all, because we haven't done a raw analysis at all. Okay, I mean PwC were paid hundreds of thousands of euros to do this. You get that? Okay, we don't have the information.
I suppose in your raw analysis of the analysis.
Exactly.
Yes.
And in turn, because we don't have access to any of the data, because that's the way a lot of this happens. Okay, I mean this is one of the big problems with infrastructure policy by and large. Okay. It's problematic because these details tend to be hidden. Why are they hidden? It's a good question, okay? But my suspicion is because people don't want to be accountable for decisions that they make, okay? I'm glad I made that point. Going back to your one, okay? How do you put numbers on that? Well, this is the art of cost-benefit analysis. It's very, very inexact, okay? Because there's an awful lot of educated guesswork. My knowledge of the analysis that was undertaken by PwC was that it was heavily invested in by them, okay? So they would have relied on a lot of previous studies, for instance, in order to come up with a number, or for something like the value that you could attach to remote working. So there's an established body of work around how to put numbers on time and cost savings. So I would have a degree of faith, in the rigour of the analysis up to that point. But the really important point is because it is imprecise, the key then would be to have it scrutinised by an independent agency of some sort. And so I mentioned the fact that DEEPR actually did scrutinise the CBA, and as a result of that, there were lots of adjustments actually made. But they identified, for instance, how sensitive the ultimate result of the CBA analysis was to certain assumptions. And for me, it highlighted the fact that you can never get this right. You can never get it really nailed on perfectly.
How could you?
And because, and I don't think, and I think that actually was demonstrated in this case, insofar as the details that are out there allow us to actually draw a conclusion on. But the key is that it was actually scrutinised. And we're down now to a cost-benefit rate, or benefit-cost ratio of 1.3 to 1, but DEEPR actually have problems with that.
So I suppose just to summarise it for myself, so there's many levers here in terms of the qualitative impacts of something like this, but there are variables taken in by the people who do these analysis.
Yeah, absolutely.
They put a value on, whatever, staying in Portlaoise 3 days a week or
sure.
5.
I mean, this is a big field in economics.
I'm
okay,
sure
and there are specialists.
No one can be definitely right.
And you will always be able to shoot holes through the analysis. But at the end of the day, I would argue. I teach the stuff. Okay, it's better than no analysis at all. And when you're talking about investing something like €3 billion of taxpayers' money, it has to be legitimately supported by a cost-benefit analysis. And I think that did happen in this case, but the merit or the value of the CBA depends largely on the scrutiny.
And also from what lens you're coming at it. If you're coming at it as an economist, and a man looking or a woman looking at just figures, you'd have one view. But if you're coming at it, I would argue, as a minister trying to deliver high-speed cable across Ireland, your lens is totally different. No disrespect to the academic lens, and we would, and as legislators and ministers, they have a different job to do. So they have to balance the the sum that the man has done in the office on the cost benefit analysis, but also balance it with the fact that we want the woman outside Skibbereen to be able to sell her pottery. So really, we're back to the academics of it, really. It's all of these variables. First of all, they're bespoke to Ireland, so you can't compare it to get an international. You can't really. Landmass, you can't. I've looked at it, you can't compare it to any other jurisdiction. So it is bespoke. The variables are arbitrary in some case. I mean, they're not set in stone. So really, it's just, I suppose, what lens you're looking at it through. And I think, I think, looking at the plan, it's the lens it's being looked at through is the delivery of broadband to Ireland and to the people of Ireland, not, you know, is it worth our while to have the woman outside Skibbereen selling the pottery, you know?
Just to react to that, and we could be here all night discussing it. I mean, I actually was aware of the fact that when we got into CBA, it could go on for a long time. But just to put it simply, CBA is not about, and I know you didn't actually say this, but the CBA is not about financial costs, okay, and benefits. It's actually social costs and social benefits. And the CPA that was used in this case actually was very complete, and it did look at all those costs and benefits. The tricky part is the benefits. Okay, KPMG, as I understood, looked after the costs. We talked about that, but PwC were commissioned to look specifically at the benefits, and we're talking about social benefits here. So identifying them is one big challenge, and you have to make choices. The tricky part, I think, actually is putting money, monetising them, putting the values. But there are established methodologies there. Internationally? Absolutely. Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And that's why I say, because it's so inexact, you'll only get the full value from it if it's interrogated by independent observers. And because it's Ireland and it's bespoke, different weighting could be attached to a different. Absolutely, exactly. So there are huge amounts of assumptions across every benefit that's identified and evaluations. And finally, Chair, I'm really sorry not keeping you this late. Just in your briefing we got. But AIR should not have been required to establish a new company. I just found that because I sit on PAC and so I've been through this before a few times. My understanding was AIR was a larger company, Open Air, and they had lots of other, you know, there's all sorts of things, selling other bits and bobs going on. Would there not have been an issue there if that company with other business to their name other than the rollout of broadband, if they were selling phones or whatever, would the state subvention, like the subsidy, not have potentially in a private company situation been pulled off to pay a pension or the point we were making in that particular paragraph was not that AIR should not have had to do that. All right. The point was that the fact that AIR would have to create a separate wholesale division, separate from Open Air in the intervention area. And then, you know, if it's competing in the wholesale market, anyone using its services would have to go to two different companies. You know, it's wholesale one in the country, you know, outside the intervention area, and the one inside the intervention area. And Open Air would not be able to compete in the intervention area, whereas other operators would. What we were basically saying there was, in terms of AIR's incentive to want to win this contract, in terms of the complexity that type of setup, that structure would create for it, would probably diminish its desire to win that contract. Whereas, again, they're assuming there'll be strong competition from the likes of an AIR or a CSIRO with existing infrastructure that they can leverage, etc. So our point was not that this should not have happened. The clear line of separation is perfectly understandable, but it definitely would have affected AIR's incentive, particularly because the department is setting up a separate governance and regulatory structure for that area. They're setting a different price. Comreg are already regulating AIR outside of that area across the country. So the conflict between what the department might want in this area, what Comreg require of AIR outside of that area. You could have a two-standard company within the company. Is that what you're saying? Within AIR, that it could have two different sorts delivering two different things. I think one of the biggest reasons they said that they withdrew was one, around the uncertainty around the regulation, but two, their access price in the intervention area would have been lower than Comreg's regulated price that they must charge. And through regulatory equivalence, they'd then have to offer that price to everybody. So I think it was
you know,
just making it unpleasant.
The conflict between what the department are doing, and that is a big structure that they're going to have to put into place. I mean, I think they've budgeted 10 million per annum up to 10. So, you know, it's a very big structure that they're going to have to put in place. And if you read the KPMG document, and it's practically every second line is if the contract is implemented appropriately, if there is appropriate governance and monitoring, if there's this, if there's that. It's constantly saying, and it says it a number of times, it's all going to come down, in terms of the success of this plan or otherwise, to the monitoring of this contract. And that's going to require a big, very well-resourced, multidisciplinary and thorough team within the department. I think they've talked about maybe a longer-term vision of a state agency to do all of this. That's a big duplication of a kind of regulatory functions in the telecom sector that a highly experienced Comreg is already doing. And I would wonder what the cost of all of that is going to be purely in order to deliver this type of plan, and the conflict that there might be and the overlap maybe with some of Comreg's existing functions.
The overlaying on the air poles, and I'm obsessed with it.
Wrap it up.
Yeah, after that, sorry. You said somewhere along the way, it's next generation technology. So is what's going on the overlaying, the next layer of cable, is that fancier than the air cable that's under it? Is it more modern?
I'm not sure. I think what Air are using, I can't be sure, but I think they're using the current, I think it's GPON is the word they use, technology, which in the future will probably be refreshed to the next generation.
There probably is a value in them putting the next generation going past it, you know?
Yeah.
Like if we had actually, I was just thinking about that, like if we had actually incorporated that, whatever type, you said the word there,
yeah.
that type, the slightly out of the, not so new generation cable, if we'd actually pulled that into the system, it could have needed an intervention, you know, it's...
Yeah, I mean, effectively, they were just trying to, I mean, the department was assuming that any bidder would try and meet its minimum 30 megabyte download requirements, so it assumed that they would use current technology. I think the big thing is really around the refresh rate. So if you put in just, let's call it the current optical equipment, and that has to be replaced in 5 or 7 years, that replacement is it's much further in the future when you've deployed, when you've got revenues. A lot of that could be funded by commercial revenues. Whereas, you know, there's a much higher cost of putting in the more advanced technology right now. Analysis Mason said that's a much higher cost, a big margin in terms of what they were assuming. But if take-up rates are pretty low in the next couple of years, and then it's going to have to be refreshed anyway in, say, 10 years' time, it's a big upfront CapEx cost that we're subsidising versus the kind of future refresh cost that had been assumed, which could be coming out of revenues in the future rather than upfront CapEx subsidised by the state.
Get your point now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for coming in. I know it was a robust, but I think very worthwhile engagement, and thank you both. So the Joint Committee stands adjourned until 5 p.m. on the 25th of June. Thank you. Thank you.